Good evening, everybody, and welcome. Thank you for coming. My name is Joel Corngut, and it's really a pleasure for me to introduce Dr. Margo DeMello, who will be our speaker for this evening. Dr. DeMello is a member of the faculty at Central New Mexico Community College. That's in Albuquerque. I think the school has about 20,000 students. It's a large school. Dr. DeMello got her PhD at the University of California, Davis in cultural anthropology. And she's president and executive director of the House Rabbit Society. Is he around there? There he is, over there. If you're not familiar with that, a lot of people aren't, the House Rabbit Society is a worldwide organization dedicated to rescuing rabbits. These are abandoned rabbits, also dedicated to educating people about having house rabbits. I have house rabbits at home. It's a pleasure to have. And also, she is the program director for the Human Animal Studies at the Animal and Society Institute. Author of several books. Some of the books are up here on animals and society. A lot of great books. We're going to have the first session will run until about 7. Then there'll be a break, and then at 7:30 there'll be another lecture on a different topic. I want to especially thank Barb Cruz and the Val Humane League for helping get this program organized. And if you have a few extra shekels or pennies in your pocket, they could always use a little help through the Val Humane League. So, any questions before we begin? We have some goodies here. What's this called?
Puppy chow.
Puppy chow, carrots, apples, water, napkins, whatever you need. So, without further ado, Dr. DeMello, thank you.
Okay, you have to give the signal.
Huh?
The signal. The light signal.
All right, turn the lights down, please. Thank you, Jamie.
Yeah, that's nice. So thank you, Joel. Thank you for inviting me, and thanks, Barbara, for having me here. There's this little guy, Peanut, who is running around down here. He can't get up the stairs, but if he looks like he wants to, you are welcome to pick him up and let him run around on the other levels, but he can't do it on his own. So I did my dissertation at UC Davis on tattooing. I studied the American tattoo community, so I've had a long interest in body modification. So I worked on that my first few years, and about 10 years ago I discovered this new field, which is not really so new anymore, called Human Animal Studies, which is the study of human-animal interactions and all of the ways in which non-human animals play a role in human lives and vice versa. It is an interdisciplinary field that is growing rapidly. There's classes being taught all around the country and all around the world in it, lots of new research in it. I had long been an animal advocate, and I had no idea that you could actually study animals in an academic context, so I was thrilled. So I've been writing now on animal issues for years. And then this particular talk, the first one I'm going to give today, is just sort of my attempt to kind of join the two issues together, the issues about body modification with animals and our treatment of animals in society. So it is such a small group that please feel free to answer questions or to ask questions while we're talking. You don't have to feel like we got to wait until the end, because it is pretty small, so we might as well get comfortable with each other. Okay. Okay, so I begin with the fact that humans and non-human animals impact each other in a variety of ways. That's the basic crux of human animal studies. Today I'm going to talk about the issue of how humans have altered the physical bodies of other animals. I'm going to begin with a little discussion, or I think I'm going to begin, or at some point I'm going to talk in this talk about how we modify our own bodies, which then I'm going to deal with at length in my second talk. So the process began with domestication. A lot of people don't think about animal domestication, how it happened, and what the implications were for both human and non-human. And so I want to spend a little bit of time going through that. So since the first animals were domesticated for food, labor, and skin, most of us, the most contact that we have with animals is through companion animals, through pets, but the notion of keeping animals as pets was quite a new historical notion. Animals were first domesticated to be consumed. Our ancestors, all humans around the planet, were at one time hunters and gatherers. They tracked wild animals, hunted wild animals, as well as gathered wild plant foods. And about 15 to 30,000 years ago for the dog, and closer to about 10 to 8,000 years ago for the other animals, our ancestors began domesticating animals. Now, the wolf was the first domesticated animal. He became the dog. The wolf was the only one who was not domesticated for food. He was domesticated to help get food. So dogs were domesticated in order to help humans to better hunt animals. So, since the first animals were domesticated for food, labor, and skin, domesticated animals have changed in a whole host of ways, both behaviorally and physically. Natural selection favored those traits that made individual species and individual animals good prospects for domestication. It's interesting to point out that of all the animals on the planet, only about 12 to 14, depending on how you count, large animals have ever been domesticated by humans. The vast majority of all animals on the planet cannot be domesticated. They don't have the right traits. The traits that make an animal easy to domesticate and appropriate to domesticate include lack of fear, curiosity, relatively small size, and gregariousness. Gregariousness just means social animals. All of the domesticated animals except one fill those categories. They're not so fearful, they're relatively curious, they have a relatively small size, and they're social animals. The only exception to that rule is the cat. Cats are not social animals, they're solitary animals. They were domesticated for a different purpose. At any rate, making the earliest domesticates look and behave differently from their wild relations. So we go from the wolf to the dog. So we go from, and I picked intentionally a picture that is so extraordinarily different from the wolf. And it's not accidental that it's so different. Now, this particular dog is a pet breed, and so it was domesticated just to be a pet. But it's a good indication of what happens during domestication. So during domestication, the assumption is that domestication was sort of a two-part process. The animals played a part and the humans played a part. Probably, if we start with the dog, probably the wolves that were starting to follow human bands around because they were attracted to the meat. There would be some wolves who were starting to spend time around humans. Within a pack, you would probably have a couple of individuals who would be a little bit more friendly, a little bit less fearful, a little bit more social, a little bit more likely to want to spend time with somebody from another species. Those individuals, thanks to whatever mutations that they might have had that led to those behavioral quirks, those would have been the ones who would have been domesticated. So it would have been sort of a process of natural selection combined later with artificial selection that led those early friendlier wolves to become companions of humans. And then humans eventually started artificially breeding them, selectively breeding them. Once humans began doing that, now they're going to be focusing on the traits that they want in their, at this time, hunting companions, which is what the dogs were. So they're going to be looking for animals who are not just a little bit friendlier, a little bit more curious, a little bit easier to control, but they're also going to be looking for animals who are smaller, who are easier to handle, who are easier to breed. And what happens then is that through selective breeding, and selective breeding 10,000 years ago, 20,000 years ago, and today means the same thing. It means you pick out the traits that you want to see in your animal, you pick two animals together that exhibit those traits, you breed them together, and then you kill some of the babies who don't meet those traits. That's what we call culling, euphemistically, but really what we're doing is we're killing. So once humans began selectively breeding their animals and killing those whose bodies or temperaments are unwelcome, in order to emphasize or discourage certain traits, the animals changed even further, resulting today in animals who are, for the most part, smaller yet fleshier. They tend to be rounder and fatter, more brightly colored, with shorter faces, rounder skulls, and more variations in fur and hair type, as well as ear and tail appearance. There's been some interesting work that's been done on foxes, fur foxes in Russia since the 1930s, where they have found that if you select for behavioral characteristics of friendliness and curiosity and lack of fear, you also get shorter snouts. You also get more bright colored fur. You also get a number of characteristics that tend to be associated with those behavioral traits. And so the animals eventually, if you take the process and continue the process, you eventually end up with an animal, not always obviously, but an animal who looks like this. So they become tamer, friendlier, and because they are perpetual juveniles, one of the other assumptions is that those early animals who became domesticated, who allowed themselves and willingly put themselves into the process of domestication, that they might have been unusual in that they were continuing to exhibit into adulthood the behavioral signs of juveniles. So we call this neoteny, the fact that our adult domesticated animals today retain the signs that baby animals once had. So that's another reason why our domesticated animals tend to be rounder, tend to be fatter, tend to have rounder heads and bigger eyes and just altogether much more acute appearance, is because those are juvenile behavioral physical characteristics that are associated with juvenile behavioral characteristics like friendliness, that stayed in some animals into adulthood. And that's again why we've got now domesticated animals who not only look different and who behave differently, but they also are literally perpetual juveniles. They're perpetually dependent on us as humans. That's one of the major implications of domestication, is that we've created new animals who need humans to survive. Then we move into artificial selection. So as soon as humans began thinking about traits that they wanted to breed for and selectively breeding for those, artificial selection began. Artificial selection picks up with farmers who are now breeding cows and pigs and sheep and goats. Those are the first domesticated farm animals, livestock animals. Farmers and later show breeders, in the case of what we now call companion animals, as they learn more about the inheritance of traits. This began with Gregor Mendel's research on pea plants. Animal breeders began selectively breeding their animals for more specific characteristics. Selective breeding has led to the creation of hundreds of breeds of dogs, just as an example, one of the most intensively bred animals in the world. Now, the dogs that we have, of course, look as different as they do, again, because of artificial selection, not natural selection, which takes tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of years. All of this has happened in just a few thousand years, and in some cases, just a couple hundred years. Dog breeds were created in order to fulfill human desires. So we bred and created dog breeds to hunt, to race, to retrieve, and then much, much later to be companion animals. So we've got these unbelievably diverse animals whose bodies have literally been shaped to meet human demands. Now, domestication changes the human-animal relationship. So all of our ancestors were once hunters and gatherers. And what that meant was that the human-animal relationship was a relationship that was somewhat of an equal relationship. I'm not going to say it was an entirely equal relationship, but the hunters typically did not overexploit animals. Now, I don't want to make it seem like it's all romantic and hunters love the animals that they killed, but there tended to be a little bit more respect than we see in the domesticate relationship today. The anthropologists who have looked at this have seen among contemporary hunter-gatherers that many contemporary hunter-gatherers feel that they actually have to get permission from the animal in order to hunt them, and that they're, again, somewhat equal in terms of both existing on the same planet and in the same material world. With domestication, we now make animals property, and animals have now been property of humans for, again, in the case of dogs, 15,000 years or more, in the case of the livestock animals, 8,000 years and less. Domestication changed this relationship into one of dominance and control as humans took on the role of master and animals that of property, becoming items to be owned and exchanged. We then create livestock. The term livestock literally means living property. It is property. It's actually a living form of wealth. So we go from the auroch, which would have been an ancient species that turned into one of the ancestors of the modern cattle. Here, animal bodies are transformed through selective breeding to create animals who are tame, easy to breed, easy to feed, and easy to control, and ultimately who become commodities. So we go from the auroch to the cow, with the ultimate goal being to create animals whose sole purpose is to create a commodity for humans. This process, not coincidentally, led to the rise of state-level civilizations. Both the domestication of plants combined with the domestication of animals created not just a surplus of food, but created the entire class stratification system that we see in modern states as well as in the ancient nation states. That system of inequality and exploitation is based on this process of turning the animal into the animal commodity, and today, with industrialization, into the animal machine. So, with industrialization, since the 19th century, animals have become meat-producing machines. I mean that quite literally, manufactured and maintained for the highest profit in conditions that our ancestors would find completely irrational. One of the things that made livestock like cows and like sheep and like goats such a practical and rational method of food production was that they were grazed on grasses. They were grazed on grasses. They would consume food that was not necessarily usable by humans and then could convert that into animal protein, which then, of course, humans would consume. Today, much of our livestock are raised not on grasses that humans can't eat, but on grains that are fit for humans. Most of today's grains that are grown in the United States, in fact, go to feed livestock like cattle. So we've sort of subverted the entire system from one that made rational sense into one that simply goes to feed the Western American desire for meat. Since the early part of the 20th century, farmers have been experimenting with creating new livestock breeds via careful crossbreeding in order to maximize size, fat composition, productivity, or other traits. So we go from domesticating and selectively breeding animals to control them, to so that they're easier to handle, so that they remain somewhat voluntarily with humans, to now being a scientific discipline aimed at the composition of the fat versus the muscle and ultimately the flesh in the body. This is just a quote. Angus cattle are hardy, undemanding, and adaptable. They mature at around 2 years of age and have a high carcass yield with marbled meat. So the focus, of course, is quick maturity so that you can slaughter them early, which makes more profit, and you want your high carcass yield with marbled meat. Then we've got artificial insemination and the ability to freeze semen, which means that even one of the most basic acts of reproduction have been taken out of animal hands and put into human hands. Cattle farmers are able to more selectively breed their prize bulls and cows to replicate the traits of their parents. Part of what natural selection is based on is diversity, is genetic variation. Within a population, you need genetic variation in order to be able to adapt to changing environmental conditions. Here we're reducing and reducing and reducing the genetic variation in such a way as to more closely replicate the most prized animals in terms of their, again, fat composition, that type of thing. With the advent of industrial methods of food production in the 20th century, changes in livestock breeds accelerated. Industrial methods of food production refer to taking some of the tenets of industrialism and the assembly line model and using that in the production of livestock. And so now, instead of having farmers with some dozens or perhaps even hundreds of chickens, now we have these huge, what we call confined animal feeding operations, which are full of tens of thousands of chickens that are packed so tightly into these cages that they sometimes can't move or shift or lie down or do any of their natural behaviors. In a livestock situation like this, an industrial situation like this, the cages are never cleaned from the time that these egg layers are put in here until they're dead, because it's just not worth the time to clean it or to take care of it. And literally, the cages are worth more than the animals who live in those cages. And what we have then is the bodies themselves have to change to make them more amenable to living in this kind of a crazy situation. Large-scale centralized production, which concentrates animals into small spaces and controls food, water, and temperatures, enables easier health monitoring and controls what the people who run these places call unnecessary and efficient animal movements. So here in the case of these pigs, it is inefficient to allow the pigs enough space to lie down. It just simply doesn't make sense. So the pigs have to be confined in this place for the majority of their lives until they're slaughtered. In the case of the breeding females, they're also artificially kept away from their babies so that they don't step on their babies, so they're in these gestation crates throughout much of their lives. No outside air, no dirt, no sunlight, and no capacity for natural movement or activities like grooming, play, exercise, unaided reproduction, or the like. This type of confinement can be compared to a total institution. If you've taken a sociology class, you know that that refers to a prison or a mental hospital or the military, something like that, in which every aspect of your life is controlled by the state or by those who control the institution, and that's what the lives are like here as well. So again, what we though are seeing is a physical change in the animal bodies in order to make them more efficient meat-making machines. So you have a wild turkey here up on the left. That wild turkey, it does not have enough meat on its body in order to make enough of a profit. So through the selective breeding, you end up with a turkey like the one here at the bottom with this enormous, enormous breast. That enormous breast puts so much pressure on the legs and on the feet that if that turkey were allowed to live his normal lifespan, like 15 years, by the end of his life, he would not be able to walk anymore. And so farm animal sanctuaries that have birds like this typically have special needs birds, and a whole lot of them, because of the fact that they can't live correctly. This is what it looks like in a turkey feeding operation, a turkey growing operation, where they're crammed in so tightly that they peck each other until, they can kill each other sometimes. So to produce the most meat in the shortest amount of time, animal agribusiness now breeds farm animals to grow at unnaturally rapid rates with radical results to the animal body. These changes have been encouraged by new developments in agricultural science aimed at improving the productivity of food animals, such as the routine use of hormones and antibiotics to keep animals alive and to encourage fast growth. That keeping them alive in such unnatural situations is obviously important, otherwise there's no point in it at all. And that's why the antibiotics are important. The pet industry too. So I hadn't talked about the pet industry. The notion of keeping animals exclusively as pets. People have kept animals as companions probably for thousands of years, but the idea of taking an animal or a whole species of animal and dedicating them just to be pets is a very recent phenomenon and is very, frankly, impractical and not terribly economic. But with the advent of the modern pet industry that emerged in the 19th century, there's profit to be made off of pets as well. So the pet industry, too, relies on artificial selection, and today, following the livestock industry, artificial insemination, to create breeds of animals with favorable, again, to human traits. Recent years have seen an escalation in the varieties of dogs, cats, and other companion animals being developed in order to appeal to discriminating consumers. So even if now with the pets we're not looking at the marble composition of the flesh, we're certainly looking at the color of the fur and the way that the ears stand up and the way that the tail looks, and these kinds of traits. So the fancy breeds. The real fancy breeds are only a couple of 100 years old. While the early breeds of dogs were created to highlight working traits, again, hunting and retrieving and racing, things like that, recent breeds have been geared more towards aesthetics. Cats were never bred to be working animals. The only type of work that cats ever did was kill mice, and you didn't breed for you didn't breed for skills at all. You just simply let it kind of happen. So when the fancy breeds of cats emerge, they are entirely geared towards aesthetics. There are no working breeds of cats. Cats are lazy, which you know if you have cats. The result is hundreds of breeds of dogs and dozens of breeds of cats, rabbits, and other species, all bred by large and small breeders to sell through the pet industry. And while, again, we don't see the diversity in body types with cats that we do in dogs, the reason we don't see that diversity is because, again, they're not working animals. So we don't have to have huge ones and little ones, you know, and all these different kinds. But we still have quite a diversity in terms of colors and fur types.
So, Dr. DeMello, would you say the similarity between the livestock situation and dogs and cats is just sheer greed? Someone wants to make money off them, so they, with dogs and cats, modify the bodies with livestock?
Sure. I mean, yes, I guess I am going to say that. I'm going to say that industrial capitalism, you know, is about the production of profit, and profit has to be produced somewhere. And so you're going to look at your factors of production at some point. And in the case of animal breeding, you've got labor, which is one thing, which I don't have time to talk about today, but certainly the way that farm workers, right, are exploited. But then you've got resources. That's what these are. And so you're going to, with the case of the livestock, you're going to make your resources as efficient as possible. So, you know, again, growth very quickly, lots of fat, or, you know, if you're not into fat these days, which a lot of people aren't, then you make them less fat, you know, more lean, that kind of thing. In the case of animals, their only worth, you know, is what people are willing to pay for them. So in the case of animals, we're not really looking at efficiency anymore. The companion animals, we're looking at aesthetics, right? And so the more expensive of an animal is one that's going to be more aesthetically worthy. So the, you know, the fancy tiger cats, you know, those kinds of things. But yeah, I think it's all profit, and yeah, I think it's all greed. Just, yeah.
I was thinking of the puppy meals as well.
Oh, sure. Oh, absolutely. There's your efficiency right there, of course. So I think I have a slide on that. I think in a couple of minutes I have a slide on that. But of course, the other thing that we have too, and again, this is where artificial selection and natural selection are so opposed to each other, is with natural selection, the animals with the most advantageous traits are the ones that are going to be, you know, more reproductively successful and are going to survive better. In the case of these guys, if we're just looking for aesthetics, then it doesn't matter what the health results are, and it doesn't matter whether the animals are going to have survival problems, whether the animals are going to have breathing problems, or whether the animals are going to have leg and joint problems, or whether the animals are going to have, you know, blindness or deafness, or those kinds of things. So we end up with health problems, some quite severe, that are bred directly into some of these animal breeds. Which you can't breed the health problems back out once you prefer an animal with a smashed in, you know, little face like that. Yeah. We're also, of course, in breeding dependency. If one of the notions about domestication in general is control, we control them, the opposite is that they then are dependent upon us. You know, I have Chihuahuas, we have 4 rescued Chihuahuas, and they are unbelievably dependent on us. They couldn't live. 2 of them had been strays before, and it's hard to even imagine how they survived on their own on the streets when now they need sweaters when it's a little chilly outside. So even without specific genetic defects associated with certain dog or cat breeds, many modern breeds of dog or cat are unable to survive without close human attention. While dependency has been bred into domestic animals since the earliest days of domestication, it has accelerated in recent years with the production of animals like Chihuahuas, who are physically and temperamentally unsuited to survival outside of the most sheltered of environments. back to the culling. So if artificial selection means that you pick the parents based on the traits that you want, you breed them together, and then you look at the offspring to see who exhibits those traits the best, and you kill the rest, you know, which is a dirty little secret of a lot of the pet breeding industry. The ones who don't conform to the breed standards, in the case, for instance, of the of dogs, the AKC standards or the standards of the very specific breed clubs, you have to either kill them. Sometimes you can sell them off as I forget what the term is, when they can be sold off as companions that just don't conform to breed standards. But this one in particular, the American Boxer Club's Code of Ethics prohibits the sale by a club member of a boxer with a coat color not conforming to breed standards. These are not health conditions. This is a coat color that is incorrect. Because up to 20% of all boxers are born white, this means the routine killing of a huge number of white babies. 1 out of every 5 boxer puppies has to be killed. The Australian Shepherd Club of America recommends immediate killing for the 25% of all puppies born white because some may be born blind or deaf. First off, that's a maybe. And second, again, it is terrible that we've created breeds in which blindness or deafness becomes a recognized and somewhat acceptable you know, result, but then to demand the killing of those babies because of that, I don't know, seems insane in some ways. So here's the industrial production of pets, the puppy mills that you mentioned. So here it is all about efficiency. So, you know, everybody knows about puppy mills, and everybody knows that when you buy a puppy from a pet store, that his parents might live in conditions just like this. So they are factory type conditions, except more filthy, in which the breeding dogs are smashed into cages. Sometimes they're as a group, other times they're, you know, single, individual, often never get out of those cages for their entire breeding lives, which could be 10 years. In the last 50 years, a new breeding model has developed to create greater numbers of puppies, kittens, bunnies, and even birds. Bird mills are one of the newest types of operations in which parrots and cockatiels and those kinds of birds are raised like this. At low cost for the pet market, animals in Class A breeding facilities, that's what they're called by the USDA, spend their entire lives in wire cages and are bred over and over again, producing litter after litter. Obviously, there's health implications here. Obviously, there's humane implications here. But there's where your efficiency comes right in. It's simply more efficient to breed them this way and to not have to let them out or have to walk them or have to give them any kind of human attention or anything other than the basic food and water, because their lives are not worth anything. What the worth is those babies who could be sold sometimes for a few $100 a baby. So again, we're moving as far away from natural selection as we can through artificial selection. Now, the other thing that we're doing is as mutations develop in some of our companion animals, mutations which are either harmless, as the case of, say, Scottish fold cats. It might not be harmless in wild cats. I guess I'm going to imagine there might be trouble if this was a wild cat, but they are domesticated animals. And then some of these mutations are quite harmful, but if they're cute enough and if they could make some money, then they are certainly going to be bred for profit. So the Scottish fold, again, not a big deal. Your twisty cat, on the other hand, is a big deal. This is a cat. Some breeder ended up with a litter of babies, some of whom had this crazy genetic mutation that results in their front legs being very, very short, like little T-Rex legs. They can't walk, so they have to hop. I'm not going to say it's not cute in some way, but it is an animal who is completely vulnerable, completely dependent on humans, and now is a new breed called twisty cats, squittens, or kangaroo cats because of the way that they hop. So, other ways in which we alter the animal body. we go from natural selection to artificial insemination, to the use of hormones and antibiotics, to genetic manipulation. If you're really going to try to create an animal that is as perfectly suited to human needs as you can, manipulating the genes of the animal themselves is really the next step, so that you take as much of the control away from sort of nature and put it more into your hands. Because pigs, beef cows, and chickens are created for one purpose, food consumption, their genes have been altered in a whole host of ways to suit that purpose, resulting in, for example, pigs engineered to have leaner meat tailor-made to suit a more health-conscious consumer. Pig breeders are now able to purchase gene markers to modify their breeder swine in order to control for traits like the number of piglets born in a litter. Obviously, you want more piglets. How efficiently the pigs will process feed. If they process feed more efficiently, you could feed them less. How quickly they will grow, and how much and of what quality the fat is present. Ultimately, pig producers will be able to feed their animals less and produce more pigs in less time with less fat and more flesh. Now, pigs, I just know personally, people who live with pigs and have rescued pigs, they're hungry all the time. They can't eat enough. It seems to not be a stereotype. It seems to be a real thing. So I can't imagine being a pork pig, a pig who's raised for pork or to breed baby pigs, and to be fed less because your genes allow you to process the food more efficiently. I can't imagine how hungry they must be all the time. Then we've got cattle. There's all kinds of ways in which you can manipulate the genes of cattle to produce more muscle, in other words, meat. The Meat Animal Research Center has been able to select for a gene that produces double muscling in cattle, producing more lean meat. Their muscles are literally doubled. This is a Belgian blue. They are a creation of genetic engineering with the specific goal of expanding the muscular content of the animals. So again, we're modifying the animal bodies as our dietary needs change, as well as the producer's demand for profit increases. I have another picture of the Belgian blue here. It's quite extraordinary, really.
Where are those found?
Farms in the Midwest.
Really?
Yeah.
Ooh.
Yeah. So these cattle are susceptible to many medical complications, such as swelling of the tongue, so the babies can't nurse, congenital articular rigidity, which affects the calf's ability to stand on its legs, cardiorespiratory problems, which can cause death, and birthing complications, which means that the mothers have to give birth by cesarean almost all of the time. Then, of course, we're going to genetically manipulate other animals as well. Really, genetic engineering is most prominent in the lab environment. In the lab environment, where animals are tools, literally tools, they're not animals. And in particular, in the case of mice, mice and rats are not defined as animals according to the Animal Welfare Act, which governs the care of animals in labs. They're not animals at all, so they don't need any protection under the Animal Welfare Act. At any rate, you need to have very specifically bred, very specifically controlled animals to do your research, and in particular for a lot of ways in which they're looking at genes, they need to have animals that you can actually modify the genes in order to see how those genes express various traits and whatnot. So we have a huge amount of genetic manipulation going on in lab animals, especially again in your rodents. Even in pets, we now have genetic manipulation. We've got a hypoallergenic cat that you can buy for about $20,000 for people who are allergic to cats. You can also buy, this was kind of popular a few years ago, these glowfish that have a sea anemone genes that make them glow. So you can turn off the lights and see your fish glow. Then, of course, we have cloning. Cloning is the ultimate in terms of control over the animal body, and it's also the ultimate in terms of the opposite of natural selection. If natural selection is about selecting the most advantageous traits that are then going to produce the most reproductively successful animals. Natural selection depends on genetic diversity within the species. Cloning is the exact opposite of that. With cloning, you're taking a female animal and you're replicating her entirely in her offspring. So there is no genetic diversity whatsoever. And you're doing so because you want to replicate those traits exactly perfectly. It is primarily used within laboratory work these days. They are using it as well within the meat industry, but technically you're not yet eating cloned animals. It was just ruled about a year ago, I forgot if it was the FDA or the USDA who ruled that it is safe, allegedly, to eat cloned animals, but they're not yet part of the food chain. But I'm sure that they will be at some point. Now, where we also are hearing about cloning, of course, is in the companion animal world. The first cloned cat, they were able to clone cats far earlier than they were dogs. The first cloned cat is this little kitten right here. Her name is Cece, for copycat. The interesting thing about the cloned cats is because the way the genes work, and I don't really understand it, the way that the colors in cats work, she actually doesn't even look anything like her mother. And she's an identical, perfect clone of her mother, but she actually doesn't look anything like her. To me, one of the tragic things about the cloning of companion animals is it preys on our love of our companion animals, and it preys on this, what's that? Yes?
Does it clone their memory too or not?
No, and I guess that's the point that I was going to make, is that people think, well, my dog, right, who's 15, who just died, who I love so much, and we had such a great life together, and if I could have a clone of him, I will have him back. You won't have him back. You'll have somebody that has his genes, and those genes are from before he was born, right? So before anything, so you're just going to have another animal who, if in the case of the cats, doesn't even look like your animal. In the case of the dogs, I think you at least get somebody who looks like them. They do cost thousands of dollars. They do result in hundreds, typically per successful clone. There were hundreds of animals who were not successful, and that means either miscarriages or live births that were not good births, that resulted in babies that were not in good shape and that, of course, were killed. In terms of the dogs were only successfully cloned for the first time a couple of years ago in Korea, and it's still not such a big deal yet because it's just a newer thing. But according to published reports of cloning studies, 3,656 cloned embryos, more than 319 egg donors, that's adult female dogs, and 214 surrogate mothers. So you take the egg from one female and you put it into another, who then gives birth, were used to produce just 5 cloned dogs and 11 cloned cats who were able to survive 30 days past birth. So that's a huge number of animals who are sacrificed in order to produce that one perfect dog who you think and you hope is your old Fluffy, but who's not Fluffy, who's just somebody that looks like Fluffy. Another way that animal bodies have been changed is through surgical procedures for both cosmetic and control purposes. So, animal reproduction. Part of domestication from the very beginning all the way up to now means controlling breeding to make sure that animals only breed with somebody they're supposed to breed with at the time you want them to breed. Also castrating or spaying animals in order to control population, or in the case of livestock, to make meat taste better, is going to be something that has been done for a huge number of years. This is a burdizo. It crushes the testicles of an animal. I don't even think I need to point out that you don't need to use anesthesia, or they don't use anesthesia, I should say. So sometimes we actually have surgical procedures. Other times we have things like banding, where you just put essentially a rubber band around the testicles of, say, a sheep, and eventually, as that band constricts, the testicles are going to fall off eventually. And again, these are procedures that happen without any kind of anesthesia or painkillers. Then And then, of course, with the companion animals, I'm not at all suggesting that we shouldn't be spaying and neutering our companion animals. Now that we have domesticated them, now that we live with them, and now that we have a pet industry that is so voracious that we have millions of animals who have to be killed every year because there's not enough homes for them, we have no choice. We have to spay and neuter them. But it is certainly another way in which they continue to be controlled by us to meet our needs, or to in order to correct a problem that we ourselves have created with the overpopulation of animals, then we have to create a solution, like surgical altering. Now, with industrial agriculture, we've got other problems. Because of the overcrowding, in the case here of egg-laying hens, they will peck each other to death. So the debeaking of hens is now common, where you sort of burn off the beak so that they cannot hurt each other so much. That's extremely common now in the egg production world. We've got tail docking for dairy cows, which is the amputation of most of the cow's tail without anesthesia. We have dehorning of cattle, also without anesthesia. We also have sheep getting their tails removed, usually via banding, which is the same thing that they do with testicles, also without anesthesia. And then, of course, in the pet world, we do surgical modification simply for aesthetic purposes, simply for breed conformity. So breed standards demand that certain dogs, for example, must have their tails docked, their ears cropped, or both. Now, the good news is that typically, at least your pet owners who are normal in terms of their level of compassion, will at least have their animals brought to a veterinarian to do this. Some vets don't do this, by the way, anymore. But you always hear about cases where a dog is brought into the animal shelter because someone just simply thought they would cut their ears off with scissors in order to make them look appropriate. Then you've got other modifications like the declawing of cats, which means removing their digits. Literally, it's their fingers, not their claws, that you take off so they can't scratch the couch. Or the debarking of dogs, where you cut the vocal cord so that they can't bark anymore. Then, of course, there's identification, property. And animals are property, and again, livestock are one of the original forms of property in the early state-level societies. Property has to be identified so that if it's stolen, you can, note it and retrieve it. And so we've had branding for thousands of years now to identify animals. The same branding, of course, was used to identify humans as well. So slaves, for instance, were identified via brands. Still popular amongst cattle ranchers today. Brands are used to prevent theft, to identify lost animals, to mark ownership, and to identify individual animals. We do have new forms of brands now. There's freeze brands, which are allegedly less painful. There's ear tags, there's tattoos, and of course, there are microchips. But they all ultimately are about the same thing, which is identification, which at one level at least is about control. All of these uses of the animal body can be illustrated with Foucault's notion of biopower, the ways in which the modern state controls and regulates their citizens' bodies. If you stay for my second talk, where we'll talk about body modification of humans and of women in particular, we will see the ways in which the state literally, again, regulates our bodies. It shouldn't be surprising to see that we have mirror procedures for both animals and for humans, unwieldy humans in particular. When it comes to animals, it's easy to see how society's needs and desires have shaped the changes to the animal body, but it's also about control over animals. It's not an accident that branding and tattooing were both once used to mark and control slaves and convicts. Then, of course, we have adornment of the animal body. This certainly seems to be the most benign of many of the things that I've been talking about today, but it's still about property. It's about ownership. It's in some ways about conspicuous consumption and the elevation of a person's status via their animal bodies. Again, perfectly benign for the most part, but I think it's an extension of the same thing. Then we have tattooing. It's not common, but there are tattooists who do in fact tattoo their pets or tattoo other animals simply as a form of display. Sometimes the animal is anesthetized beforehand. If the animal is not, I can tell you personally that it would hurt like crazy to be done. And of course they don't know what it is either, and it's not like they're there willingly. And imagine that when they're on the throat, how that would hurt. And again, it's a mark of ownership, and it's a mark of status for the owner. You know, things like this, again, for the most part, perfectly benign. Where it's not so benign is the sale of dyed ducklings or chicks or bunnies at Easter time. They're essentially sold as a fairly inexpensive novelty toy. You know, they might be killed, they might be eaten, they might be given away. Who knows what might happen to your little $4 dyed chick after Easter. So I want to end with a discussion. We're almost out of time, but I want to end with a quick discussion about human versus animal, the ways in which we try to distinguish ourselves from each other. I want to go through this super briefly. Again, if you're staying for my next talk, I'll talk a lot more about some of this stuff. Humans modify their own bodies with tattoos, piercings, scars, and other methods, which I will discuss later. These adornments and modifications create, communicate, and maintain status and identity and incorporate people into the social world. Other practices are used to control humans, like branding, forcible tattooing, practices like castration and female genital mutilation, except for female genital mutilation, again, the castration, the branding, and the tattooing, all used to control animals. Again, marks of ownership and control, just like they are and were for animals, have been used that same way for humans. There's a convict, there's a slave, which are still being done today. This is a Holocaust tattoo from Auschwitz. The modification of animal bodies functions like the second area of human body modification, to incorporate animals into culture as property rather than persons. So the dog on the end of the leash, leashed into the backyard, is just as visible an illustration of his property status as having his ears cropped or being tattooed or something like that, or even just being a domesticated dog. Animal bodies are treated by law and common practice as objects which are owned and controlled. They can be bred, bought and sold, can be used for labor, for food, for entertainment, and as a collection of resources that are both separable and commercially transferable, right? We disassemble our livestock as meat. We also use animals for things like xenotransplantation, where you take organs out of animals, put them into other animals or humans. Their bodies can be patented, manipulated, dismantled, and modified on both the genetic and physical levels. Tattooing, branding, artificially inseminating, debeaking, dehorning, genetically modifying, and cloning. All of these procedures serve to remove the wild animal from animals and to replace that with human control, generally in order to profit off of them. Through these maneuvers, we turn animals into products of our own making to fulfill our own desires. And I'm actually going to stop here because we're out of time. And like I said, I'll continue some of the human stuff with my next talk. Yes?
Question?
Uh-huh.
What about using animals for medical research?
Uh-huh.
Humans, what do you have to say about that?
I mean, it's part of the same whole process. I mean, you can certainly argue that we use animals for experimentation because it's unethical to use humans, but of course we did used to do that, right? We've done that throughout human history many times. We finally realized, especially after World War II, after the Holocaust with the Nuremberg Code, that turns out to not be an ethical thing to do. We don't have a Nuremberg Code for animals, so we continue to use them as resources in that same way. There are alternatives. They're certainly not as advanced, some of them, because that's not where the resources are. There is certainly a lot of money to be a laboratory animal producer. So the economic, I think the economics of that industry are such that there's not enough of an incentive for more scientists to move away from animals, you know, seems to me. But I think it's all part of the same process. Again, the fact that they're property and the fact that their bodies are there for us to use is what makes that an acceptable thing to do. And the fact that we justify that by saying, well, it's not like they're like humans. They can't feel like us, and so they don't feel pain, or they don't suffer, or they don't anticipate. So they're not like us, and yet at the same time, we use them for that because they are like us. An animal model, by definition, you're using an animal model to test, say, human drugs or procedures because you are saying they're enough like us. They're enough like us to use them, but they're not enough like us to not use them, you know? Yeah.
Two quick questions. Early on in your presentation, you had mentioned that there's been thousands of years of change in evolution traits of different dogs. But you had mentioned that some have occurred within the last couple of years. What are some examples of those dogs?
Oh, just some of the brand new breeds. I mean, some of the, the super new breeds, the Labradoodles and, those kinds of dogs. This experiment with the foxes that's been going on in Russia is another example of how the process of domestication, which originally spanned over thousands of years, we don't know how long it actually took for those first wolves to have become, kind of humanized and domesticated, but what they're doing with the foxes shows that you can speed that process up, and you can actually make it happen very quickly so that within a few generations, literally, you go from wild foxes who are fearful and aggressive and all the things that wild animals are to cuddly and playful and friendly and darling little round little foxes. And they made that happen super quickly. One of the terrible things about that research, of course, is that it was done on a fur farm in order to make the foxes more easy to control before you kill them. And so the ones that, when they do the culling, to get the friendliest ones, the ones that aren't quite friendly enough, they're killed right away for fur. Some of the super friendly ones are lucky because they actually get adopted out into Russian families as companions. But they live in those awful wire cages, and I don't know, it seems worse when they are bred to love humans and then they're living in those wire cages.
Well, my second question was based off of the puppy mills and the wire cages. Is there any data or research done that the offspring of these puppy mills, the babies, are they more troublesome?
There seems to be health problems,
Health problems.
that come out of that.
Just because of the stress and the conditions?
I don't know exactly what that points to. It could just be the inbreeding because, of course, again, the more you want to control for traits, the more inbreeding you have to do. And we know from evolution that inbreeding is not good. That the more inbred you have, the less variation that you have and the ability to ward off, illness and all kinds of things. But, if you want your puppy perfect to look like that perfect puppy, then that's what you're buying. Other questions or thoughts, comments? Do we want to break here then?
Yeah, I appreciate